some evidence is impossible to ignore. A video, silent and cold, that shows a father forcing his 6-year-old son to run on a machine built for adults. A machine set to a speed the boy cannot match. We watch as he falls, his small body thrown backward by the relentless motion of the belt. We watch as his father picks him up and places him back on, again and again. It is a moment of cruelty so clear, so unambiguous, it needs no explanation. But this is not a story about what was caught on camera. It is a story about what was missed. It is a story of 100 warnings, 100 phone calls from a terrified mother, and a system that was supposed to protect a child, but instead failed to listen. This is the story of 6-year-old Corey Micciolo, a boy who was seen by everyone, but saved by no one. There are moments captured on camera that are so devoid of humanity, they defy explanation. They exist in a cold, digital silence, replaying a truth the mind struggles to accept. On March 20th, 2021, inside the sterile, fluorescent-lit fitness center of the Atlantic Heights Clubhouse in New Jersey, one such moment was recorded. The video shows a small boy, 6-year-old Corey Micciolo, on a treadmill. Beside him stands his father, Christopher Gregor. The machine is moving too fast. Corey's legs, barely able to keep up, churn in a desperate, unsteady rhythm. He is trying. You can see him trying, his small body angled forward, fighting the relentless pull of the belt. Then, he falls. His legs fly out from under him, and he is thrown backward, skidding along the rough surface of the machine. It is a fall that should end the exercise. It is a moment where a father should rush in, scoop up his child, and check for scrapes and tears. But Christopher Gregor does not. He calmly walks over, lifts his son by the shoulders, and places him back on the moving belt. The boy's feet scramble for purchase, and for a few seconds, he finds his rhythm again. But the speed is too great. He falls a second time, and a third, and a fourth. Each time, his father puts him back. The boy is a rag doll, his limbs flailing, his body a testament to a force he cannot overcome. At one point, Gregor leans down over his son's head. In the grainy footage, it appears as if he is biting him. The action is quick, vicious, and utterly incomprehensible. The boy on the treadmill is trapped in a loop of failure and punishment, a cycle from which there is no escape. This video, played for a horrified jury 3 years later, would become the indelible image of this case. It is the proof, the unblinking, objective evidence of a father's cruelty. But the true horror of Corey Micciolo's story is not what was caught on camera, but what was ignored long before the lens ever saw him. The story of his death does not begin in that gym. It begins with the sound of a telephone ringing, again and again, in an office that was supposed to protect him. For 18 months, Corey's mother, Brianna Micciolo, had been sounding an alarm. In sworn testimony, she stated that she had contacted New Jersey's Department of Child Protection and Permanency, the agency known as DCPP, over 100 times. 100 calls, 100 warnings, 100 pleas for someone to see what she saw. She reported bruises that couldn't be explained by the normal tumbles of a 6-year-old boy. She described an odd-shaped bruise on his forehead, as well as one on his chest. She spoke of a child who was becoming increasingly fearful, a boy whose light was dimming under the shadow of his father's care. Each call was a cry into a bureaucratic void. Each report was a piece of a puzzle that no one seemed willing to assemble. Brianna was a mother fighting a two-front war, one against the man she feared was hurting her child, and another against the very system designed to be her ally. In a later interview, her voice was heavy with the weight of that impossible battle. "I don't know if it was incompetence on DCPP's side," she said, "or they just didn't believe me." This is the central, agonizing question of Corey's story. How does a system built on the premise of the best interests of the child fail to hear 100 warnings? The law demands evidence. It requires a high threshold for intervention, balancing the sanctity of parental rights against the safety of a child. But in the space between procedure and action, Corey Micciolo was lost. It wasn't just his mother who saw the signs. At one point, a welfare check was conducted by Officer Angel Roman of the Barnegat Police Department. He too saw the marks. He testified in court that he had observed scrapes and bruises on the young boy. His testimony was a critical piece of corroboration. It confirmed that the injuries were not a mother's invention or exaggeration. They were real. They were documented by law enforcement. And yet, nothing changed. Corey remained in the shared custody of his father. The system's failure to act created a vacuum, and in that vacuum, the abuse was allowed to escalate. The Treadmill incident on March 20th was not an isolated event. It was the culmination of a long, slow burn of cruelty. It was an act of punishment so brazen it was performed in a public space, under the unblinking eye of a security camera. Christopher Gregor was not hiding his actions. He was normalizing them. Days after the incident, Brianna saw the new bruises on her son and took him to a doctor. It was there, in the safety of an examination room, that Corey finally gave voice to his father's logic. When asked how he got the marks, how he ended up falling on that machine, the 6-year-old offered a simple, devastating explanation. He said his father made him run on the treadmill because he was too fat. Think of the weight of those words. A child, barely old enough to read, has already absorbed a message of profound self-loathing. He has been taught that his body is wrong, that it is a source of his father's displeasure, and that pain is the price of correction. He was not just being physically abused, he was being psychologically dismantled. He was being taught that his father's cruelty was a consequence of his own failings. In his mind, he wasn't a victim. He was a disappointment. And he was trying so hard not to be. As one legal analyst would later observe while watching the treadmill footage, "You see how hard this little boy, little Corey, is trying to impress his dad. He's running as fast as he can. He's just trying to make his dad happy." The treadmill, in this story, becomes more than just a piece of evidence. It is a symbol. It is a metaphor for a child running as fast as he can, enduring pain and exhaustion, all to please a man who keeps turning up the speed. It is a machine that promises progress, but offers only a punishing, stationary loop. Corey was running, but he was going nowhere. He was trapped in a cycle of abuse that the adults around him, the ones with the power to stop the machine, were failing to recognize. The weeks leading up to his death were a cascade of missed opportunities. The bruises were seen, the mother's calls were logged, the child's own words were heard. Yet every gear in the machinery of child protection seemed to grind to a halt. The burden of proof, it seemed, was higher than the visible evidence of a child in pain. The final, and perhaps most tragic failure occurred on April 1st, 2021, just one day before Corey's death. After being hospitalized with a series of alarming symptoms, stumbling, slurred speech, nausea, he was examined at Jersey Shore Medical Center. Despite the presence of numerous bruises and contusions on his body, the hospital discharged him. The official record gave him a clean bill of health. A clean bill of health. For a boy covered in the marks of his father's rage. For a boy whose body was already beginning to shut down from an injury no one could yet see. It was the system's final, fatal miscalculation. It was an act of institutional blindness that sent a child back into the hands of his abuser, armed with a false assurance that everything was fine. But everything was not fine. The clock was ticking down. Corey had just over 24 hours to live. The 100 warnings had gone unheard, and now there would be no more. Help sometimes arrives too late. For a child trapped in a world of silent suffering, the promise of an open door, of a listening ear, can be the only thing to hold on to. On the morning of April 2nd, 2021, such a promise was on the horizon for Corey Micciolo. After months of his mother's warnings, after the documented bruises and the ignored reports, the system had finally scheduled an appointment. On this day, Corey was due to be interviewed by a trained child abuse evaluator, a professional whose entire purpose was to see what others had missed, to hear what a 6-year-old might be too afraid to say. It was a chance, a single, fragile opportunity for his truth to be heard. He never made that appointment. Instead of being driven to an interview that might have saved his life, Corey woke up from a nap that morning in a state of terrifying physical collapse. The boy who had been forced to run on a treadmill just 13 days earlier could now barely stand. He was stumbling, his speech was slurred, and his small body was racked with waves of nausea. He was struggling to breathe. The internal damage, the unseen wound that had been festering inside him, was now catastrophically shutting down his body from the inside out. His father, Christopher Gregor, drove him to the Southern Ocean County Medical Center. What happened next is a study in the chilling banality of evil. As medical staff rushed to diagnose a child in acute distress, the father's actions began to paint a portrait not of concern, but of detachment. While doctors and nurses fought to understand the cascading failure of Corey's organs, hospital surveillance video captured Christopher Gregor walking out of the emergency room. He left. While his son was fighting for his life, his father walked away. The medical team continued their desperate work. They ordered a CT scan, hoping the images might reveal the source of the crisis. But during the scan, Corey's body gave out. He suffered a massive seizure. At 5:02 p.m., 6-year-old Corey Micciolo was pronounced dead. He died alone, without his mother by his side. Prosecutors would later allege that Gregor had specifically told hospital staff not to contact Brianna Micciolo, and that even while on the phone with her, he refused to tell her where their son was. A child's death in a hospital is a tragedy. An unexplained death is a mystery, and a mystery demands an investigation. The Ocean County Prosecutor's Office was notified, and the first crucial steps were taken to preserve evidence.
What do you work for?
The Ocean County Sheriff's Office with the Crime Scene Investigation Unit.
Did you become involved in the investigation into the death of Corey Micciolo?
Yes.
And do you know when you became involved?
On April 2nd, 2021, approximately 6 p.m., we received a call for a death of a 6-year-old down at Southern Ocean Medical Center in Ocean County, Stafford Township.
After receiving that notification, what did you do?
Immediately dispatched 2 of my detectives to the hospital to gather information and also document the condition of the body at that time.
Investigators, including Sergeant Matthew Scuddy, went to Christopher Gregor's home. Inside Corey's bedroom, they noted the distinct, acrid smell of cleaned or dried vomit, a silent testament to the boy's final, agonizing hours. While police were piecing together the scene, Christopher Gregor was making his own plans. He did not stay in New Jersey to grieve or to cooperate with the investigation. He fled. Just 2 days after his son's death, police body cam footage shows him being stopped by officers in Tennessee, hundreds of miles away from the hospital where Corey died. But it was Gregor's digital trail that would reveal the cold, calculated nature of his mind. In the days following Corey's death, investigators would uncover his Google search history. The queries were not those of a bereaved father seeking solace or answers. They were the questions of a man assessing his own legal jeopardy. He searched. There was a murder determined from an autopsy. How long to file charges? The search was a confession of foresight, an admission that he knew what the doctors would find. He knew it wasn't an illness. He knew it was a homicide. The initial autopsy performed by the Ocean County Medical Examiner's Office confirmed his fears. The report was blunt and unambiguous. Corey Micciolo had died from injuries due to blunt force trauma. The medical mystery was over. A criminal investigation had begun. On July 7th, 2021, Christopher Gregor was arrested and charged, initially, with endangering the welfare of a child. But the full, horrifying extent of Corey's injuries would take more time to uncover. The case was turned over to forensic pathologist Dr. Thomas Andrew, who conducted a more detailed analysis. His findings, delivered in a report in March of 2022, were devastating. Dr. Andrew concluded that Corey had died as a result of blunt force impact of the chest and abdomen. He detailed a large contusion on one of Corey's lungs. He described 2 separate injuries to the liver, a laceration, or tear, on its right edge, and a contusion underneath its capsule. But the most catastrophic injury was to the boy's heart. Dr. Andrew found a laceration, a tear in the tissue, on the inside wall of the heart near its tip. He would later testify that this was an acute traumatic injury that had occurred between 4 and 12 hours before Corey's death, placing the fatal blow squarely within the time frame that he was in his father's exclusive care. The manner of death, Dr. Andrew concluded, was a homicide. With this report, the charges against Christopher Gregor were upgraded. The initial charge of child endangerment was now joined by a charge of first-degree murder. The man who had walked out of the emergency room, who had fled the state, who had Googled the legal consequences of an autopsy, would now have to stand trial for killing his son. The missed appointment on the morning of April 2nd was no longer just a symbol of the system's failure to listen. It was now the endpoint of a murder. the final, silent moment before the truth of what happened in that house would be exposed to the world. Healthy 6-year-olds don't just die in the course of a business day. With that single, stark sentence, prosecutor Jamie Schron drew a line in the sand of the Ocean County Courthouse. On one side was the ordinary world, a place of scraped knees and bedtime stories. On the other was the world Christopher Gregor had created for his son, a world that ended in a hospital room on a Friday afternoon. The trial that followed was not just about establishing guilt. It was a battle over the very nature of reality, a fight to define the last, violent moments of a child's life. Over 6 weeks, the prosecution, led by Schron and Christine Lento, methodically constructed a wall of evidence. At its foundation was the silent, damning footage from the Atlantic Heights clubhouse. The jury watched as a father forced his son back onto a treadmill again and again, his actions a cold, repetitive loop of cruelty. They watched the boy fall, his small body thrown by the machine's relentless motion. They saw the father's hand on his head in what appeared to be a bite. This was the abuse they could see. But the act that killed Corey Micciolo was invisible, a catastrophic event that had happened deep within his body. To make it visible, the state called Dr. Thomas Andrew. The forensic pathologist took the stand and with clinical precision guided the jury into the autopsy suite. He became Corey's last witness. He testified that the boy had died from blunt impact injuries, a clinical term for a brutal assault. He described the damage: a large contusion on his lung, a lacerated liver, and the fatal wound, a tear on the inside wall of his heart. This, Dr. Andrew explained, was an acute traumatic injury, one inflicted just 4 to 12 hours before Corey's death, a window of time when he was in the sole custody of his father. The defense, led by attorney Mario Gallucci, had a different story to tell. Their strategy was to create doubt, to offer alternative realities that could explain the tragedy without malice. They argued that Corey's death was the result of natural causes, a sudden and severe illness. Their star witness was Dr. Michael Baden, a renowned forensic pathologist whose name carried significant weight. Dr. Baden testified that Corey could have died from a rapid-onset pneumonia or sepsis, an overwhelming infection that could mimic the symptoms of trauma. And what of the internal injuries that Dr. Andrew had described? The defense offered another explanation: the frantic, life-saving efforts of the emergency room staff. They argued that the lacerations to Corey's heart and liver were not the cause of his death, but a tragic consequence of the aggressive CPR performed in a desperate attempt to revive him. The courtroom was transformed into a theater of scientific conflict. 2 esteemed doctors, looking at the same set of facts, the same body, presented 2 irreconcilable truths. For the jury, it was an almost impossible choice. They were not doctors or scientists. They were 12 ordinary citizens asked to decide which version of reality was true beyond a reasonable doubt. Was Corey Micciolo killed by a violent blow from his father? Or did he die from a sudden illness, his body then damaged by the very people trying to save him? The prosecution moved to dismantle the defense's theory. Dr. Andrew was unequivocal. When asked directly if CPR could have caused the deep, internal tears he observed, his answer was firm. He had never, he testified, seen CPR cause an internal laceration of the heart like the one that killed Corey Micciolo. He told the jury that the location and severity of the injuries were simply not consistent with resuscitation efforts. The prosecution bolstered his testimony with other experts, including a pediatrician and a disease specialist, who testified that there was no evidence Corey had died from an infection. Throughout it all, Christopher Gregor remained a silent observer in his own trial. He chose not to testify, not to offer any explanation for the Treadmill video, for his son's final hours, for his own incriminating Google searches. His silence left a void at the center of the trial, a space the jury had to fill with the evidence presented to them. On May 31st, 2024, the jury delivered its verdict. Christopher Gregor was found not guilty of first-degree murder, but he was found guilty of the lesser charges: aggravated manslaughter and endangering the welfare of a child. It was a partial victory for both sides, a legal distinction that acknowledged his responsibility for Corey's death without affirming the premeditated intent of murder. 2 months later, on August 2nd, the final chapter of the legal process unfolded at his sentencing. This was the moment for the human cost of the crime to be entered into the official record. One by one, Corey's family members spoke. But it was his mother, Brianna Micciolo, who delivered the most searing indictment. Standing in the same room as the man who killed her son, she gave voice to years of pain, fear, and loss.
6-year-old boy who was just alive and well with me a few hours. My heart stopped and my whole body collapsed from the shock that took over my whole body. I was unable to breathe. My mind.
Corey was, and still is, my life, my world, and my everything, she began. What this monster did was pathetic, disgusting, and I wish him nothing but the worst. Her voice, filled with a mixture of grief and fury, echoed through the courtroom. She spoke of the future her son would never have. No first girlfriend, no high school graduation, no children of his own. Christopher robbed him of his entire future, she said. He stole over 70 years from Corey. Then, her statement turned from grief to a chilling warning. His twisted mind truly thinks that I caused all this and that he's in jail because of me, even though he's here because he killed him. I truly believe if he ever gets out and gets the opportunity, he will kill me. When it was his turn to speak, Christopher Gregor stood and faced the judge. He was seen wiping away what looked like tears, but his words offered no remorse, only denial. I want to assure you, he said, his voice steady. On April 2nd, I did nothing to cause Corey's passing. I did not hurt my son. I love him, and I still do. I regret not bringing him to the hospital sooner. I didn't know how sick he was. I just thought he was tired. Judge Guy P. Ryan listened to it all. He weighed the evidence, the verdict, and the raw, human testimony. He then delivered his sentence. For the crime of child endangerment, Christopher Gregor was sentenced to 5 years in prison. For the crime of aggravated manslaughter, he was sentenced to 20 years. The judge ordered the terms to be served consecutively, one after the other, for a total of 25 years. Under New Jersey's No Early Release Act, he will be required to serve at least 85% of that time before he can even be considered for parole. Justice, in the end, is a number. It is a calculation of years meant to balance the scales of an immeasurable loss. For the death of a 6-year-old boy, the price was 25 years. As Christopher Gregor was led away, he left behind a courtroom filled with the echoes of a tragedy, a mother's 100 warnings, a child's final labored breaths, and a justice system that, in the end, delivered a verdict, but could never restore what was lost. For Brianna Micciolo, the fight is not over. She is pursuing a lawsuit against the state of New Jersey, seeking accountability for the agency that she believes failed her son. After the sentencing, she spoke of her future, not just as a grieving mother, but as a warrior for the voiceless. I want to be an advocate for other children that are dealing with this, she said, because no child should be abused. The trial of Christopher Gregor is over, but the questions it raised about our duty to listen, our responsibility to act, and our promise to protect the most vulnerable among us have only just begun.